He turned 40 in a house made of silence. Arthur was a man carved from the unforgiving prairie itself, his heart a locked chest buried deep beneath the dust of memory. Each day was a ritual of solitude, a penance paid to the ghosts of a wife and son taken by a blizzard years ago. His small ranch was a testament to grim efficiency, a place where life was endured, not lived. With him was his daughter, Lily, a child of 6 who had learned the language of quiet things, for her father spoke only in the clipped commands of work and necessity. The world outside his fences was a distant rumor, a place he no longer had any use for. But the world, in its relentless way, came to him. It arrived on the back of a savage dust storm, a churning wall of brown that scoured the land and blotted out the sun. As he barred the door against the howling wind, he saw a figure stumble through the haze, a fragile silhouette against the apocalyptic gloom. It was a woman, her clothes thin and torn, her face a mask of exhaustion and fear. She was Chinese, a stranger in a land that was not kind to strangers. Her name was Mai, a word as soft as the silk she no longer wore, and her request was simple, desperate. "Can I stay the night?" He looked at her, then at the storm, his mind a war between caution and a flicker of something long dormant. His life was a carefully constructed fortress against complication, and she was the world knocking at his gate. He gestured toward the barn, his voice as rough as burlap. "The barn. You can stay till it passes." It was not an offer of kindness, but a transaction of survival. Shelter for her, continued solitude for him. He watched her nod and retreat into the maelstrom, a small, resilient form swallowed by the chaos, and for the first time in a long time, he felt the cold certainty of his isolation waver. In the pale, dust-choked light of morning, Arthur expected the barn to be empty, the woman a mere phantom of the storm. But the world he awoke to was subtly altered. The wind had died, leaving behind a world draped in a fine coat of rust-colored silt. Inside the barn, a space he had only ever seen as functional, a quiet order had been imposed. The hay was neatly stacked, a torn horse blanket was mended with a series of tiny, perfect stitches, and the air was still. He entered his own home and the change was more profound. A scent, unfamiliar and warm, met him at the door. It was the smell of wild herbs and simmering broth. In his kitchen, standing over his cast-iron stove, was Mai. She had found the last withered vegetables in his root cellar and the forgotten herbs growing by the fence line, and from them, she had created sustenance. She did not offer apologies or explanations for her intrusion. She simply turned, her movements economical and graceful, and ladled a steaming bowl of soup for him, and another, smaller one for Lily. Arthur stood frozen for a moment, the warm bowl in his hands a foreign object. He ate in his customary silence, but the silence felt different. It was the first meal cooked by another's hands in that house in 7 years, and the warmth of it seeped past his throat and into the cold, hollow place inside him. It was a simple act, a pot of soup made from scraps, but it was also the first stone laid in the foundation of a new world, a quiet declaration that life, however neglected, was determined to persist within these 4 walls. The storm passed, but Mai remained. There was no discussion, no new arrangement made. She simply stayed, and he did not ask her to leave. An unspoken pact settled over the ranch, a fragile truce between his grief and her resilience. She moved through his house not as a servant, but as a quiet force of restoration. She did not change his world, but mended it. The curtains his wife had sewn, long faded and torn, were taken down, washed, and repaired with thread that almost matched. The small vegetable patch, choked with weeds and sorrow, was slowly cleared and tended until green shoots pushed through the dark soil. She hummed as she worked, ancient, sorrowful melodies that filled the spaces between the floorboards and the rafters, replacing the oppressive silence with a gentle melancholy. Lily, a child who had grown in the shadow of her father's stillness, was drawn to this new, warm presence. She began to follow Mai, a small, silent satellite orbiting a sun she had never known. She watched Mai's hands as they kneaded dough, as they stitched a patch onto Arthur's worn shirt, as they coaxed life from the dormant garden. One afternoon, while Arthur watched from the shade of the porch, Lily approached Mai with a fistful of crumpled prairie flowers. She held them out, a silent offering. Mai stopped her work, her eyes softening as she took the small bouquet. She didn't put them in water to wither and die. Instead, she carefully placed them between the pages of an old book, a gesture of preservation, of honoring a small, beautiful thing. It was the first gift offered and received in that house in years, a silent transaction of grace that cracked the stone around Arthur's heart. The truth all began, as it so often does, with the simple, devastating honesty of a child. Evening had settled over the ranch, the sky outside a deep, bruised purple. Inside, the fire cast a warm, flickering glow. Mai was showing Lily how to braid colorful threads into a small bracelet, her nimble fingers moving with practiced ease. Lily watched, her face a study in concentration, before looking up at Mai. Her voice, when it came, was clear and pure in the quiet room. "Did you have a little girl before you came here?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Arthur, mending a bridle in the corner, went still. He saw Mai's hands falter for a fraction of a second. She did not look away from the child. Her voice was soft, laced with a pain that was old but not gone. "I had a son," she said. "He was very brave. He is with his father now, in the stars." She did not elaborate, did not weep. It was a simple statement of fact, a map of her own lost world. Overhearing it from the shadows, Arthur felt the words like a physical blow. His own grief, a private, jagged thing he had hoarded for years, suddenly found an echo. He looked at this foreign woman, this stranger who had drifted into his life, and saw not an outsider, but a fellow survivor. He had seen her as a woman fleeing hardship, now he saw her as a soul who understood his own language of loss. The chasm between them, once a vast canyon of culture and silence, was suddenly bridged by a single, shared wound. In that moment, the transactional nature of their arrangement dissolved, replaced by the fragile, unspoken recognition of two hearts that had both been broken by the world. Autumn arrived with a cruel, biting wind, stripping the leaves from the lone cottonwood tree and painting the prairie in shades of rust and decay. With it came the fever. It moved through the sparse settlements like a malevolent spirit, and one morning, it found its way into their small house. Lily woke with it, her skin burning, her breathing shallow. Arthur's carefully ordered world shattered. The stoicism that had served him for years was a useless shield against the terror of losing another child. The doctor was in a town a full day's ride away, a journey made impossible by a sudden, violent storm that trapped them in their wooden box, the rain and wind clawing at the walls. Arthur paced the small cabin, his large frame a cage of helplessness, his silence replaced by the ragged sound of his own breathing. He was a man who could tame a wild horse and face down a blizzard, but he could not fight the fire raging inside his own daughter. It was Mai who became the anchor in the storm. While Arthur was lost in his fear, she moved with a quiet, focused calm. She drew on a knowledge that felt ancient and profound, gathering herbs she had collected from the plains, brewing teas that filled the cabin with a pungent, earthy scent. She bathed Lily's forehead with cool water, her touch gentle but firm. For 2 days and 2 nights, she did not leave the child's side, her small frame a bastion of serene strength against the howling chaos both inside and outside the house. Arthur could only watch, a silent, broken witness, as this woman he barely knew fought for his daughter's life with a fierce and tender resolve he had thought had vanished from the earth. On the second night, the storm reached its zenith. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and the rain fell in solid, unforgiving sheets. Lily's fever had not broken, and her small breaths were whispers of life in the roaring darkness. Arthur, defeated, collapsed into a chair by the hearth, the firelight catching the utter despair on his face. He buried his head in his hands, and the dam of his silence finally broke. The words came out in a raw, cracked whisper, addressed to the ghosts in the room. "I lost her mother and brother in a storm like this," he confessed, the admission tearing through him. "A white-oat. They froze, looking for a stray calf I should have found myself. I was safe in the barn. I couldn't protect them. The guilt was a poison he had carried for 7 years. He expected nothing from my pity, perhaps, or an uncomfortable silence. Instead, she rose and brewed a pot of tea. She didn't sit beside him, didn't touch him or offer hollow words of comfort. She simply placed a warm tin mug on the small table by his elbow and returned to Lily's bedside. It was an act of profound understanding. She knew that some griefs were too large for words. In that shared, lamplit silence, surrounded by the fury of the storm, their pasts were finally laid bare. His failure to protect his family, her loss of a husband and son, her journey through a hostile world. They were no longer a rancher and a stranger, a man and a woman. They were two survivors, huddled together for warmth against the long, cold night of memory, finding a fragile sanctuary in each other's quiet presence. As if tied to the child's life, the storm broke with the fever. Lily woke in the pale light of a clean-washed morning, her eyes clear, her skin cool. A new, tentative peace settled over the homestead. The silence that returned was different now, layered with the shared vulnerability of the storm. Weeks later, their supplies dwindling, Arthur knew they had to make the trip to town. As their wagon rattled down the main street, Arthur felt the familiar weight of eyes on them. Whispers followed like burrs, sharp and clinging. The townspeople saw a broken widower and the Chinawoman who had taken up residence in his home, and they drew their own ugly conclusions. In the general store, a portly, callous man named Henderson, who held the note on a neighboring property, cornered them by the flour barrels. He looked past Arthur, his gaze lingering on Mai with undisguised contempt. "Heard you got yourself some new help, Arthur," he drawled, a smirk twisting his lips. "Strange choice. A man ought to honor his wife's memory, not replace it with foreign charity." The insult was a lit fuse. Arthur, a man who had not raised his voice in public for years, moved with a sudden, startling stillness. He stepped directly between Henderson and Mai, shielding her with his body. His voice was not loud, but it had the density of granite, and it silenced the store. "This woman," he said, his eyes drilling into Henderson's, "is under my protection. You will show her respect. Her name is Mai." He then turned to the storekeeper, his every movement deliberate. He requested a bolt of the finest blue cloth, an impossible luxury. When it was brought, he paid and, in front of the stunned onlookers, placed it gently into Mai's hands. The act was more than a purchase, it was a public declaration, a claiming. It was the sound of a silent man finally speaking, not for himself, but for her. The journey home was made in a silence that was thick with all that had been said and done. The bolt of blue cloth lay on the seat between them, a vibrant symbol of his public choice. The air was no longer charged with tension or uncertainty, but with a deep, resonant understanding. They worked together to unhitch the horses and put away the supplies, their movements falling into an easy, familiar rhythm. That evening, after Lily was asleep, Arthur found Mai standing by the open cabin door, looking out at the vast, star-dusted canvas of the prairie sky. The cool night air smelled of dust and distant rain. He came to stand beside her, not so close as to be imposing, but close enough to share the same patch of night. He was not a man of poetry or grand pronouncements. The words of love and courtship were a foreign language to him. So he spoke the only language he truly knew, the language of the land, of work, of building a future. "The winters are hard here," he began, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "The roof on the east side needs mending before the first snow. And the garden, it could be larger." For a family, it was not a question, but a statement. An offering. He was not asking for her hand in marriage with flowery phrases, he was offering her a life, a shared future built of practical things, mending roofs, turning soil, facing the harshness of the seasons together. It was a proposal forged in the quiet realities of survival, a promise of shared labor, shared burdens, and the shared warmth of a hearth against the cold. Mai did not look at him at first. She continued to gaze at the immense, silent sweep of the prairie, as if reading an answer in the distant constellations. The world Arthur offered was not an easy one. It was a life of hard work, of isolation, of facing the small-minded prejudices of the world beyond their fences. But it was also a world of fierce protection, of quiet respect, of a space being made just for her. It was a home. Slowly, she turned her head, her dark eyes finding his in the faint starlight. She did not need to speak the words he did not have. Her answer was in the gentle, accepting curve of her mouth, in the way the tension finally left her shoulders. Then, she did something that closed the final distance between them. She reached out, her slender fingers closing around his large, calloused hand. His hand, which had only ever known the roughness of leather reins and axe handles, was suddenly enveloped in a warmth that seemed to travel up his arm and settle directly in his chest, where the ice had been for so long. Her touch was not just an acceptance of his clumsy proposal, it was an acceptance of him, of his silent grief, of his broken past. It was a quiet promise that he was no longer alone. The narrative camera of the soul pulls back, framing them in the warm, yellow light of the doorway, two solitary figures who had found their way to each other, a tiny island of profound connection in the vast, dark expanse of the American West. The house was no longer a tomb. The fire inside burned brightly, and its dancing shadows on the wall looked, for all the world, like they were holding hands. The seasons turned, each one leaving its mark on the land and on the new family that tended it. Winter came, and the mended roof held firm against the snows. Spring followed, and the enlarged garden bloomed, a riot of greens and reds, nurtured by Mai's patient hands. Summer baked the prairie golden, and Arthur taught a laughing Lily how to ride a small pony he had bought for her, while Mai watched from the porch, a quiet smile on her face. The ranch, once a stark monument to loss, was now a place of gentle, growing life. The crushing silence had been replaced by a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the sounds of a child's play, the rhythmic chop of an axe, the soft humming of an ancient melody. Arthur, the man who had turned 40 alone in a fortress of his own making, had been saved not by a grand event, but by the steady, quiet grace of a woman who had arrived in a storm. He had learned that a heart, no matter how long it has been frozen in the winter of grief, can feel the spring and thaw. He had offered a stranger shelter for a night, a simple transaction of survival, and in return, she had given him back his life. Mai had not erased the ghosts of his past or replaced the memory of what he had lost. Instead, she had shown him that a house could be big enough for both memory and hope, that a heart could learn to build a new life alongside its scars, proving that the most enduring love stories are rarely shouted. They are whispered. They are grown quietly, patiently, like a wild prairie flower pushing its way through the hardest earth to finally reach the sun.